The day I understood that I had been living someone else's version of my own life was not a dramatic day. There was no single moment of revelation, no confrontation, no door slamming, no voice raised in a room full of witnesses. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October, and I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store, and I had been sitting there for 22 minutes because I could not make myself go inside. Not because I was sad. Not because I was afraid. Because I had spent so many years making myself smaller, quieter, less visible, less demanding, less inconvenient to the people around me that even the ordinary act of walking into a store and choosing what I wanted felt like a permission I had not been given. I sat in that car and I looked at my hands on the steering wheel, and I thought about the preceding 14 years of my life and what they had produced and what they had cost and what I had allowed to happen to a person I did not fully recognize as myself anymore. Then I picked up my phone and I called the one person who had been telling me the truth for years and who I had been too deep inside the situation to hear clearly. She answered on the second ring. I said, "You were right." She said, "I know." "What are you going to do about it?" I said, "Everything." That word, everything, was the beginning of the longest and most deliberate and most complete reversal of a life's direction that I have ever undertaken. It took 4 years. It was worth every single day of those 4 years. And when it was finished, the people who had spent 14 years treating me as a resource to be managed discovered what happens when the resource decides it has been managed long enough and has learned, in 4 years of quiet and deliberate preparation, exactly how to stop being manageable. My name is Vivienne Cole. I am 54 years old. I was born in Memphis, Tennessee, the only child of a father who was a jazz musician and a mother who was a librarian and who between them produced a daughter who loved music and books and who had more imagination than practical self-protection, and who paid for that imbalance in ways that took her the better part of 4 decades to fully understand and address. I grew up in a house where kindness was the primary language, and where the assumption that other people were operating in good faith was so embedded in the household culture that skepticism felt like a character flaw rather than a reasonable response to available evidence. I carried that assumption into every relationship of my adult life. I carried it into a first marriage that lasted 3 years and ended without drama when both parties acknowledged that we had been better friends than spouses. I carried it into a career in nonprofit development where I spent 16 years raising money for organizations that did important work, and where I was consistently valued for my ability to build relationships and consistently undercompensated for the results those relationships produced. And I carried it into the situation I am about to describe, which was the longest and most thorough education in the cost of misplaced trust that I have ever received, and from which I graduated, finally and completely, in the parking lot of a grocery store on a Tuesday afternoon in October. The situation was a professional partnership that became a personal dependency, that became something that I do not have a single clean word for, because the English language does not have a single clean word for the specific experience of being systematically diminished by people you trusted completely, and who had the skill and the patience to do it gradually enough that you did not notice how far the diminishment had gone until you were sitting in a parking lot unable to make yourself go buy groceries. I will describe it as clearly as I can. In 2009, I joined a consulting partnership with 2 colleagues, a man named Richard Holt and a woman named Stephanie Marsh, both of whom I had known for several years through the nonprofit sector, and both of whom I respected professionally and trusted personally. The partnership was built on a structure that seemed equitable at the time of its formation, and that I understood later to have been designed with an equity that was more apparent than actual. I brought the client relationships. Richard brought the financial management. Stephanie brought the operational infrastructure. The partnership agreement divided the revenue and the decision-making in proportions that seemed reasonable in 2009, when I had not yet understood that the proportions of a partnership agreement are less important than the proportions of who actually controls the information and the money and the decisions on a daily basis. Richard controlled the finances. Stephanie controlled the operations. I controlled the client relationships and produced the majority of the revenue, and was told consistently and with apparent warmth that my contribution was the heart of what we were building. I believed it for 14 years because the telling was skillful, and because my assumption of good faith was so deeply embedded that the evidence of what was actually happening registered as something other than what it was for longer than I want to admit. What was actually happening was a systematic and patient extraction of value from my professional relationships and my professional reputation by 2 people who had understood from the beginning that my asset was my network and my ability to maintain it, and who had built a structure around that asset that ensured the financial benefit of the asset flowed primarily to them, while the work of maintaining it fell primarily to me. Over 14 years, the partnership's revenue grew from approximately $400,000 annually to just over $2.3 million. My compensation grew from a third of the original revenue to a salary that Richard managed, a salary that had been adjusted twice in 14 years, and that by year 12 represented approximately 18% of the revenue I was generating. The remaining 82% was managed by Richard and accounted for in ways that I had stopped examining carefully, because Richard's explanations were always thorough and Stephanie's operational reports were always organized, and the combination of thoroughness and organization had the effect of making careful examination feel unnecessary and slightly rude. I had stopped examining, I had stopped questioning, I had started managing my own expectations in the way that people manage expectations when they have been told often enough and warmly enough that what they have is good that they have stopped asking whether good is accurate. Stephanie had told me once in year 7 that I was the soul of the partnership. Richard had said in year 9 that none of it would exist without me. They said these things with what appeared to be genuine feeling. I had held those words for years as evidence that the partnership was what I believed it to be. In year 14, I had an accountant look at the books for the first time, and I understood what those words had actually been doing. Her name was Margaret Osai, and she had been recommended by a friend who described her as the kind of accountant who tells you what the numbers actually say rather than what you want them to say. I hired her in September, a month before the parking lot Tuesday, because I had been having a recurring thought that I had been suppressing for 2 years, and that had finally become too persistent to suppress. The thought was simple. I had been in this partnership for 14 years and I was 50 years old, and I did not have the financial position that 14 years of partnership in a $2.3 million business should have produced. Margaret reviewed 3 years of partnership financials. She asked me for the partnership agreement. She reviewed the agreement. She asked me 12 questions over 2 meetings, and then she produced a summary document, and she sat across from me and she said, "Vivienne, I want you to read this document carefully and I want you to ask me any questions you have." I read it. The document showed that my compensation over the preceding 3 years had averaged $312,000 annually. It showed that the partnership's net revenue over the same period, after legitimate operating expenses, had averaged $1.4 million annually. It showed that the gap between my compensation and the revenue I had generated, documented through client attribution records Margaret had requested, was not distributed to an operating reserve or reinvested in business development. It was distributed to Richard and Stephanie through a series of mechanisms that the partnership agreement technically permitted, because I had signed an agreement in 2009 that I had not had independent legal review of because I had trusted the people I was signing with. I read the document, I asked 2 questions, I went to my car, I sat in the parking lot of the grocery store for 22 minutes, then I called my friend and said you were right. I want to describe the 4 years that followed the parking lot, because they are the part of this story that people find hardest to understand when I tell it in abbreviated form. The hardest part to understand is why it took 4 years when the documentation was already clear and the case for departure and legal action was already established. I will explain. I stayed for 4 years after the parking lot Tuesday because leaving immediately would have cost me significantly more than leaving correctly, and because leaving correctly required the patient and deliberate construction of a position that I had not yet built, and that could not be built quickly without becoming visible to the people I was building it in response to. Richard managed the finances. That meant Richard managed the information about the clients and the revenue and the contracts. If I left without documentation of what was mine, the client relationships I had built over 14 years would remain nominally associated with the partnership, and Richard and Stephanie's ability to retain them would depend entirely on whether the clients themselves chose to follow me or stay. Most clients follow relationships, not organizations, but only when the relationship has been maintained in a way that is independent of the organization's infrastructure. I spent 4 years quietly and without announcement reestablishing my client relationships on a personal and direct basis, having conversations that were genuine, and that reconnected the relationship to me as an individual rather than to the partnership as an entity. I did this while continuing to work within the partnership at the same level of commitment and quality I had always brought, because doing otherwise would have created visibility I did not want. I also spent 4 years building the legal and financial documentation that Margaret and I developed together into a case that was, by year 4, as complete and specific and resistant to challenge as 4 years of careful documentation can make a case. I am going to describe the exit in the terms that matter because the exit was the thing 4 years of preparation had been building toward, and it deserves to be described with the precision it was executed with. I gave notice on a Monday morning in March, 4 years and 5 months after the parking lot Tuesday. I did not give 2 weeks' notice. I gave notice through my attorney, a woman named Caroline Assant, who had been working with me and Margaret for 2 of the 4 preparatory years, and who delivered a formal departure notice accompanied by a legal filing asserting claims for unpaid compensation, breach of fiduciary duty, and unjust enrichment that was supported by 4 years of documented evidence. The filing was specific. It named amounts, it named dates, it named the mechanisms through which the gap between my compensation and the revenue I generated had been maintained. It included the client attribution documentation. It included the partnership agreement analysis. It included Margaret's 3-year summary and the subsequent 3 years of documentation that had followed it. Richard and Stephanie received the filing on Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, their attorney had called Caroline. By Tuesday morning, they had requested an emergency meeting. Caroline told them the meeting would happen in her conference room on Thursday and not before. On Thursday, Richard and Stephanie arrived with 2 attorneys. I arrived with Caroline and Margaret. I sat across the table from 2 people I had worked with for 14 years and who had spent those 14 years telling me I was the soul of the partnership, and I did not say anything for the first 40 minutes because Caroline was saying what needed to be said and saying it better than I could have said it, and because my silence was its own kind of statement about how far things had moved from the room where they had been told I was the soul of something. The mediation that followed the Thursday meeting lasted 3 sessions over 6 weeks. I am not going to give you the specific settlement number because Caroline advised against it and because the specific number is less important than what it represented. What it represented was a complete financial accounting of 14 years of professional contribution that had been systematically undercompensated, calculated by Margaret using the client attribution records and the revenue data and the market rate for the work I had been performing, adjusted for the 14-year timeline with appropriate interest. It also represented the formal release of my client relationships from any partnership claim, a release that Richard's attorneys initially resisted, and that the client attribution documentation made untenable to continue resisting, because the documentation established that the relationships were mine in any meaningful professional sense and had been mine for years before the partnership had existed. Every client I had quietly reestablished on a personal basis over the 4 preparatory years signed a letter of engagement with my new practice within 60 days of the settlement. Not all of them, most of them. The new practice generated $740,000 in revenue in its first year of operation. I operated it alone for the first 6 months and then brought in 1 associate. My compensation in year 1 of the new practice exceeded everything I had received in the final 3 years of the partnership combined. I want to be clear about what that number means. It means that what I had built over 14 years, the relationships and the reputation and the professional value, had always been worth what it was worth. The difference was that now I was the one keeping it. I want to address what happened to Richard and Stephanie after the settlement because the story is not complete without it, and because what happened to them was not something I engineered, but something that was produced by the same logic that had been operating in the partnership for 14 years, just directed differently. The settlement required them to pay the settlement amount and to release the client relationships and to operate the remaining partnership without the revenue source that those client relationships represented. The partnership's revenue in the year after I left was approximately $400,000, the same figure it had been when I joined in 2009. The operational infrastructure that Stephanie managed and the financial management that Richard performed had been wrapped around a revenue-generating core that was mine, and when the core left, the infrastructure had nothing to wrap around. I did not take satisfaction in this in the way that people sometimes expect satisfaction to look. What I felt was something closer to a quiet confirmation that the numbers had always said what they said, and that the people who had been ignoring what the numbers said had eventually had to face them. Richard called me once, 8 months after the settlement, and the call had the quality of a man who wanted to say something specific and could not quite bring himself to say it directly. He said the practice had been struggling. I told him I was sorry to hear that, and I meant it in the specific limited sense that I am sorry when any human endeavor that was once functional ceases to function. I did not offer to help. I wished him well. I ended the call. I went back to the client proposal I had been working on. It was a good proposal. The client signed it the following week. I think about the parking lot sometimes. The 22 minutes, the hands on the steering wheel. The inability to make myself go inside and choose what I wanted. I understand now that the parking lot was not a breaking point. It was an arrival point. I had been traveling toward that parking lot for years, and I did not know it was a destination until I arrived at it and recognized it as the place where the person I had been slowly becoming would have to acknowledge what she knew. The diminishment had been so gradual and so skillfully maintained that I had participated in it without fully understanding that I was participating. I had made myself smaller because smaller had been rewarded. I had stopped questioning because questioning had been discouraged. I had accepted the narrative that my contribution was the soul of the partnership because the narrative was warm and because warmth is a powerful substitute for accuracy when a person is not in the habit of distinguishing between the two. The parking lot was where the habit finally broke. 22 minutes of sitting still, and the habit broke, and everything that followed was built on the foundation of the break. I am grateful for the parking lot. I am grateful for Margaret Osai and her summary document. I am grateful for Carolina Sant and her 3 sessions of mediation and her ability to say in precise legal language what I had experienced in 14 years of professional life. And I am grateful, in a way that surprised me when I first felt it, for the 14 years themselves. Because the 14 years produced the client relationships and the professional reputation and the documented record of value that made the settlement and the new practice and the $740,000 first year possible. You cannot reverse what was not first built. The building was mine. The reversal was mine. Both of them are part of the same story, and I am telling it now because both parts deserve to be told. My name is Vivienne Cole. I am 54 years old. I spent 14 years being the soul of something that was extracting value from me while telling me I was valued, and I spent 4 years quietly and patiently, and without announcement, building the position from which to reverse that situation completely. I sat in a parking lot for 22 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon, and I called my friend and I said, "You were right," and she said, "I know," and I said everything, and I meant every syllable of it. From victim to victorious is not a straight line, and it is not a fast one, and it does not look from the outside the way it looks from the inside. From the outside, it looked like 14 years of a successful partnership and 4 years of continued successful partnership and then a departure. From the inside, it looked like the slow and deliberate reconstruction of a person who had allowed herself to be managed into smallness and who spent 4 years growing back to her actual size while the people managing the smallness believed the management was still working. The management had stopped working in a parking lot in October. They did not know that for 4 more years. By the time they found out, the position was complete and the documentation was ready and the clients were mine and the new practice was already in motion. I was not the victim in that story. I was the person who had been a victim and who had become, through patience and documentation and the 4 years of quiet work that followed a 22-minute Tuesday, something entirely different. If this story reached something in you, leave a comment. Tell me where you are watching from. Subscribe if you have not already. Topics 2 and 3 are coming and they are worth the wait.